The images flickering across screens in Beijing, Moscow, and Washington today are grainy, chaotic, and unmistakable. They show a man in a disheveled tracksuit, hands bound behind his back, being guided by masked operators toward the open ramp of a C-17 Globemaster. To the casual observer, this is just another breaking news alert, a sudden flash of violence in a volatile region. But to those who understand the architecture of global power, this is not a news event. It is a transaction. The man is Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and his capture marks the precise moment where the United States decided that the price of patience had finally exceeded the price of intervention. For 20 years, Washington watched Venezuela slide into chaos. They watched as the jewel of South America, the nation with the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, transformed into a forward operating base for its geopolitical rivals. They watched Russian bombers land in Caracas and Chinese firms buy up the energy grid. But empires are slow beasts. They tolerate insults and inconveniences for decades, calculating the cost of action against the cost of inaction, until the math changes. And in 2026, the math changed. The raid on the Miraflores Palace wasn't about restoring democracy, and it wasn't about humanitarian aid. It was a repo job. The United States has essentially repossessed a country to secure the energy assets it believes are critical to its survival in the 21st century. To understand why this happened now, you have to strip away the diplomatic rhetoric and look at the physical reality of the American industrial machine. The United States is the world's largest oil producer, yes, but there is a fatal flaw in its energy dominance. The shale oil produced in Texas and North Dakota is light and sweet. It flows like water. But the massive refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast, the cathedrals of steel and pipe that turn crude oil into the diesel, jet fuel, and gasoline that power the American economy, were not built for light oil. They were engineered decades ago to process heavy sour crude, thick, sludge-like oil. For generations, that heavy oil came from two places, the Middle East and Venezuela. When the U.S. sanctioned Venezuela into oblivion, they cut off their own supply of heavy crude. They forced their own refineries to rely on Russian heavy oil, and then, after the Ukraine war, on sporadic shipments from the Middle East. It was a strategic vulnerability that kept generals and CEOs awake at night. They knew that if a major war broke out in the Pacific or Europe, the U.S. supply chain could be strangled not by a lack of oil, but by a lack of the right kind of oil. The capture of Maduro solves this physics problem overnight. By installing a transitional government, the U.S. Navy hasn't just secured a coastline, they have secured the Orinoco Belt. They have guaranteed that the refineries in Louisiana and Texas will have a steady, secure feed of heavy crude that doesn't have to cross a hostile ocean to get there. This is energy security in its rawest form. But this is not the first time the United States has reached out and physically dismantled a government to fix a strategic problem. In fact, if you study the history of American intervention, you realize that the capture of Maduro is almost a shot-for-shot remake of a movie we have seen before. The script was written in Panama City in 1989 and perfected in Baghdad in 2003. The actors change, but the plot remains rigid. It begins with a client, a leader who is useful to the empire. In the 1970s and 80s, Manuel Noriega was that man in Panama. He was on the CIA payroll. He was Washington's man in the Canal Zone, a brutal but effective operator who helped the U.S. funnel weapons to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. He was our dictator. But like all clients who stay in power too long, Noriega began to forget who signed his checks. He started playing both sides. He trafficked drugs, he flirted with Cuba, and most dangerously, he threatened the stability of the Panama Canal, the jugular vein of American trade. When George H.W. Bush decided Noriega had to go, he didn't wait for a UN resolution. He launched Operation Just Cause. It was a massive, overwhelming invasion. 27,000 troops descended on a country the size of South Carolina. They didn't just want to defeat the Panamanian Defense Forces, they wanted the man. They hunted Noriega until he took refuge in the Vatican Embassy. And then, in a display of psychological warfare that was both bizarre and terrifying, the U.S. Army set up massive speakers outside the embassy and blasted rock music. Van Halen, The Clash, Guns N' Roses, 24 hours a day until Noriega broke. When he finally surrendered, he wasn't treated like a head of state. He was treated like a criminal. He was handcuffed, put in a jumpsuit, and flown to Miami to face trial. The message to the rest of the region was crystal clear. Sovereignty is a concept that applies to enemies, not to vassals. If you threaten a core strategic asset like the canal, your diplomatic immunity evaporates. We saw the same script play out in 2003 with Saddam Hussein. Like Noriega, Saddam was once a useful asset. During the 1980s, when he was gassing Iranians, Washington looked the other way because he was fighting our enemy. We provided him with intelligence. We allowed him to buy dual-use technology. But when he invaded Kuwait and threatened the oil flow of the Persian Gulf, his status changed from asset to monster. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was sold to the public on the lies of weapons of mass destruction. But the strategic logic was purely imperial. The US wanted to plant a flag in the center of the Middle East, democratize the region by force, and secure the third largest oil reserves in the world. The capture of Saddam Hussein was the climax of that operation. When US troops pulled him out of that spider hole near Tikrit, bearded and bewildered, it was a piece of theater designed to humiliate. It was the empire, showing the world that no one is untouchable. And now, 23 years later, we are watching the same scene in Caracas. The raid on Maduro is not an anomaly. It is the continuation of a specific American tradition, the decapitation strike against formerly useful assets who have become strategic liabilities. However, to view this solely through the lens of recent American history is to miss the larger picture. The United States is not inventing this behavior. It is inheriting it. The logic that drove the Marines into Panama City and the Delta Force into Caracas is the same logic that drove the Roman legions into Alexandria. Empires, by their very definition, cannot tolerate insecurity regarding their critical resources. They are vast, complex systems that require a constant, uninterrupted flow of inputs, grain, silver, oil, silicon, to maintain their stability. When that flow is threatened, the empire does not negotiate, it annexes. Consider the parallels with Rome. In the 1st century BC, Rome was a city of 1 million people. It was the master of the Mediterranean, but it had a weakness. It could not feed itself. The Italian peninsula didn't have enough farmland to support the massive population of the capital. Rome relied entirely on grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa. This grain was the oil of the ancient world. If the grain ships stopped arriving at the port of Ostia, the mob would riot, the economy would collapse, and the emperor would fall. For a long time, Rome was content to let the Ptolemaic dynasty run Egypt. Cleopatra and her ancestors were client kings, much like the Saudi royal family or the Venezuelan governments of the pre-Chavez era. They guaranteed the flow of grain, and in exchange, Rome protected them. But when that relationship became unstable, when Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony and threatened the political order of Rome, Augustus Caesar didn't send a diplomatic envoy. He invaded. Augustus defeated Antony and Cleopatra, but he didn't just install a new client king. He did something unprecedented. He annexed Egypt as the personal property of the emperor. He forbade any high-ranking Roman senator from even entering the province without his permission. He seized the grain supply directly. He realized that the resource was too critical to be left in the hands of a local ruler, no matter how friendly they claimed to be. He needed absolute control. This is exactly what we are witnessing in Venezuela. The Orinoco Belt is the modern Nile Valley. The heavy crude is the modern grain. For decades, the U.S. was happy to let PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, run the fields. Even after the 1976 nationalization, American companies were still the technical operators. The spice flowed. But under Maduro, that arrangement collapsed. By intervening now, the United States is pulling an Augustus Caesar. They are deciding that the risk of leaving this resource in the hands of a volatile local government is too high. The Transition Council being installed in Caracas right now is populated by technocrats, many of whom have spent the last decade living in Miami or Houston. They are the modern equivalent of the Roman prefects sent to administer Egypt. Their job is not to build a Venezuelan utopia. Their job is to get the pumps working and ensure the tankers are heading north, not east. But there is a darker side to this imperial calculus, a cost that is often hidden in the initial euphoria of victory. The capture of a leader is the easy part. It is the mission accomplished banner on the aircraft carrier. It provides a dopamine hit of righteousness and a sense of control. But history warns us that the decapitation of a regime often unleashes forces that the empire cannot control. When the U.S. removed Saddam Hussein, they didn't just remove a dictator, they removed the lid on a boiling pot of sectarian violence. They dismantled the Ba'athist state, the army, and the police, creating a vacuum that was filled by al-Qaeda in Iraq, and later ISIS. The cost of that quick victory was 20 years of insurgency, trillions of dollars, and a broken Iraq that eventually drifted into the sphere of influence of Iran, America's greatest rival in the region. When the U.S. removed the Taliban in 2001, they thought the war was over by Christmas. They spent the next 20 years trying to build a centralized democracy in a land of tribes, only to watch it all collapse in a single week, in August 2021. The images of desperate Afghans falling from C-17s in Kabul are the bookend to the images of Saddam's statue falling in Baghdad. They are the alpha and omega of imperial overreach. So, the question that haunts the capture of Maduro is simple. Is this Panama or is this Iraq? In Panama, the intervention worked, cynically speaking. The U.S. captured Noriega, dismantled his army, installed a new government, and left. Panama became a stable, pro-American democracy and a banking hub. The canal remained secure. It was a successful imperial police action because Panama is small, the population was relatively pro-American, and the strategic objective was limited. But Venezuela is not Panama. It is a country of 30 million people, twice the size of Iraq. It is awash in weapons. It has armed militias, the colectivos, who are fiercely loyal to the ideology of Chavismo. It has complex border conflicts with Colombia and Guyana. And unlike Panama in 1989, Venezuela has powerful friends. Russia and China may not have intervened militarily to save Maduro, but they have the cyber and financial capabilities to make the occupation a living hell. They can fund insurgencies, they can sabotage infrastructure, they can turn Venezuela into a quagmire that drains American resources just as the U.S. is trying to pivot to the Pacific. The planners in the Pentagon are betting that the hunger of the Venezuelan people will override their nationalism. They are betting that if they can turn the lights back on and put food on the shelves, the population will accept the new order. They are banking on the Panama model. But the ghosts of Fallujah and Kandahar are watching closely. They know that when you break a state, you own all the broken pieces. And Venezuela is broken in ways that will take a generation to fix. We have explored the historical echoes and the imperial logic. But we must now turn to the financial mechanics of this seizure. This operation is being framed as a restoration of democracy. But if you follow the money, it looks much more like a hostile corporate takeover. The capture of Maduro effectively wipes the slate clean on tens of billions of dollars in debt that Venezuela owed to Washington's rivals, while simultaneously opening the door for the greatest reconstruction contract bonanza of the 21st century. Consider the debt. Under Chavez and Maduro, Venezuela borrowed over $60 billion from China and billions more from Russia. These loans were backed by oil. China didn't lend cash out of charity. They lent it in exchange for guaranteed shipments of crude for the next 30 years. By removing Maduro and declaring his regime illegitimate, the new U.S.-backed transitional government has a legal pretext to declare these debts odious. In international law, odious debt is debt incurred by a dictatorship for purposes that did not benefit the people. If the new government defaults on these Chinese loans with Washington's blessing, it is a massive financial blow to Beijing. It essentially tears up the mortgage China held on the country. At the same time, the reconstruction of Venezuela's oil sector will require an estimated $200 billion in capital investment over the next decade. The pumps are rusted, the pipelines are leaking, and the refineries are dangerous ruins. Who will get the contracts to fix them? It won't be the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation. It won't be Rosneft. It will be Halliburton, Chevron, Baker Hughes, and Bechtel. The capture of Maduro has just created a massive new market for American service companies, funded by the very oil they are extracting. It is a closed loop of value extraction that would make the British East India Company blush. This economic dimension explains why the United States was willing to risk the international backlash. The potential return on investment is staggering. We are talking about controlling the energy tap for the entire Western Hemisphere. With Venezuela back in the fold, the North American energy bloc, Canada, the US, Mexico, and Venezuela, becomes completely self-sufficient. It insulates the American economy from the shocks of the Middle East. It neutralizes the power of OPEC. If the price of gas spikes because of a war in the Persian Gulf, the U.S. can simply open the tap in the Orinoco. However, this aggressive move signals the death of the rules-based international order that the U.S. claims to uphold. For 70 years, Washington has preached that borders are sacred, that sovereignty is inviolable, and that disputes should be settled in the UN Security Council. By conducting a unilateral decapitation strike against a UN-recognized head of state, the U.S. has effectively admitted that those rules no longer apply when core interests are at stake. This is a dangerous precedent. If the U.S. can seize the leader of Venezuela because energy security, what stops China from seizing the leaders of Taiwan? What stops Russia from escalating its operations in Eastern Europe under the guise of buffer security? The capture of Maduro strips away the veneer of civilization from international relations. It returns us to a 19th century world where great powers carve out spheres of influence and police them with gunboats. It is the formalization of a new Cold War, where the globe is divided into rigid blocks, and the non-aligned nations are forced to pick a side or be swallowed whole. And what of the Venezuelan people? In the grand calculations of energy security and imperial perimeters, they are tragically reduced to background actors. The narrative promises them freedom, and perhaps in the long run, a competent government will improve their lives. But in the short term, they are facing the trauma of occupation. The purge of the Chavista elements from the government will likely lead to witch hunts and social instability. The privatization of state assets will lead to a shock therapy economy where prices skyrocket, and the safety net, however tattered, disappears. The history of U.S. interventions in Latin America, from Guatemala in 1954 to Chile in 1973, suggests that the welfare of the local population is rarely the priority. The priority is stability. The priority is a favorable investment climate. If democracy produces a leader who threatens that stability, history shows that democracy is readily sacrificed. The Venezuelans are trading the incompetence and repression of Maduro for the efficiency and indifference of foreign capital. They are swapping a local warlord for a distant CEO. As the C-17 carrying Nicolás Maduro touches down on American soil, we are witnessing the closing of a circle that began with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. President James Monroe declared that the American continents were henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. For 200 years, the U.S. has viewed Latin America not as a collection of neighbors, but as a backyard, a buffer zone, a property. There were moments when this grip loosened. The good neighbor policy of the 1930s, the brief idealism of the Alliance for Progress. But whenever the stakes got high, whenever the empire felt threatened, the iron fist came down. The capture of Maduro is the ultimate reaffirmation of this doctrine. It is a message sent to every capital from Havana to Buenos Aires. You can have your elections, you can have your flags, and you can have your anthems, but you cannot have our oil, and you cannot invite our enemies into our house. We are entering a new era of naked realism. The polite fictions of globalization are evaporating. The idea that trade would make us all friends, that economic integration would prevent war, has died in the Ukraine, in Gaza, and now in Caracas. We are back to the old map, the map of resources and choke points and spheres of influence. The capture of Maduro is a tactical victory for the United States. It secures the heavy crude. It humiliates a rival. It steadies the energy markets. But structurally, it is a sign of weakness, not strength. A confident empire leads by example and economic attraction. An insecure empire rules by force. Rome didn't seize Egypt when the Republic was at its healthiest. It seized Egypt when the Republic was dying and the autocracy was beginning. It seized the grain because it had lost the ability to sustain itself any other way. The United States has spent the last 20 years squandering its moral authority and its treasury on wars of choice. Now, facing the rise of a peer competitor in China and a recalcitrant Russia, it is circling the wagons. It is consolidating its hold on the essentials. It is making sure that no matter what happens in the rest of the world, Fortress America has enough fuel to keep the lights on and the tanks running. Venezuela is the first casualty of this new defensive imperialism. It will likely not be the last. As resources become scarcer and the climate becomes more volatile, the scramble for the remaining assets of the planet will intensify. The raid on Miraflores is a preview of the wars of the mid-21st century. Swift, brutal, and centered entirely on the physical inputs of survival. So, as you watch the footage of the fallen president and the triumphant Marines, do not look away. Do not let the partisan bickering over socialism versus capitalism distract you from the reality of what just happened. A superpower reached out and broke a sovereign state to feed its own engine. It is a story as old as Babylon, as old as Rome, as old as the British East India Company. It is the story of how the world actually works. The empire has eaten, the perimeter is secure, and the cost will be paid, as it always is, by the people living on the ground, and by the soldiers who will have to occupy the peace. Thanks for watching Empire Cycles. If you value this kind of unfiltered historical analysis, please leave a like. It helps these stories reach a wider audience. I want to hear your perspective. Do you think the U.S. will hold on to Venezuela? Or is this another 20-year quagmire? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation into the cycles of history. I'll see you in the next video.